Hello everyone. So in this, what hopefully is going to be quite a nice short video, we're going to think about who is Inspector Ghoul, and we're going to look at 9 different suggestions. So there's a little task for you to start off with, and if you look down in the description box underneath, you'll be able to link to the document that has got all of this lot on it. And if you want to, what you can do is cut the box into 9 pieces and have a little play with them, doing a diamond 9 for yourself. And then to have a think about that, what you can do is write a couple of sentences justifying why you gave the highest priority to the one that you chose, a sentence to explain why you put the lowest priority one at the bottom, why you don't agree with it at all, and then finally just choose one of those middling ones and explain why you put that in the middle. Okay, so that's your task to start off with, just to get you thinking about these 9 different interpretations for Inspector Ghoul. What I'm going to do now is go through each of those one by one and see if you're going to keep your order the same at the end. So if you can pause the video, go and do your diamond 9, and then come back when you've got your order and see if you still want to keep it in the same order afterwards. Okay, so the first one which I've picked out is a real policeman who's caught out of time. And I got this interpretation out of the last but one edition of the GCSE York Notes. And what they suggested in York Notes was that when the phone rings at the end of the play and Mr. Burling is told a policeman's coming round because a girl has died, he wants to ask you some questions, that it's going to be Inspector Ghoul again. So they suggest that it's going to be the same inspector who comes back to question them. So it's almost as if the inspector is caught in this kind of time loop. Now, you'll know, well, you might not know, there was a TV series on called Life on Mars, and then there was a follow-up series called Ashes to Ashes, and both of those are kind of time traveling police documentaries, and certainly not documentaries, time traveling programs where 2 different police inspectors have been caught out of time and they have to cope in different times. Obviously, it's used in a really different way in Inspector Ghoul's, but this is one suggestion, that it's Inspector Ghoul himself, that he's been somehow caught out of time and he's just going to keep looping round until those Burlings, the older ones, make the changes that they need to do. So that's one interpretation. Now, where would I rank this interpretation? I would rank this as a definitely maybe. So I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10 for yes, this is what I think that JB Priestley was suggesting, but I'd probably give it a 6 or a 7 out of 10. It's definite maybe for a police inspector caught out of time as one interpretation of the inspector. Well, here's another one which is really similar. And if you think about what we've learnt in the previous 2 lessons about JB Priestley's time plays and his including the theories of Donne and Ouspensky, definitely this idea that the inspector is a time traveller is a really interesting one to explore. And the picture that I've chosen to go with this is Doctor Who's. So it's this kind of idea that this much more knowledgeable, kind of much more powerful character who doesn't belong to a particular place or time can actually go into and interfere in people's lives or the running of humanity or whatever, to try and make things better, to try and improve things for the better by interfering in some small or some major way. Is definitely something that JB Priestley would want to explore. So the previous one where he's like a policeman caught out of time, maybe that's a bit too specific and that's why it's a maybe. But this idea that Inspector Ghoul could be a time traveller, I'd put that a little bit higher. So I'd say, yeah, I do definitely think that that's something that JB Priestley was hinting at. So I'd probably give time traveller 8 or a 9 out of 10. Okay, the next one is an interesting suggestion that the inspector is an exorcist. And with an exorcist, obviously you've got links to the horror genre. It's a really, really famous movie called The Exorcist. It's also got religious connotations as well. So that links into ideas about morality, which are really important. The idea of him being an exorcist links in also to the meaning I've been using for ghoul, but also links into the idea of the Burling's conscience, the fact that each of them didn't seem to have any kind of moral conscience at the beginning of the play, but by the end of the play, the inspectors began to have an impact. So, those of you who don't know, an exorcist is linked to Christianity, and priests often perform as exorcists themselves, even nowadays. If someone believes a building is haunted, a priest some priests know how to perform an exorcism. It's about getting rid of evil spirits and getting them out into the open so that that spirit can pass over to the afterlife, whether that be sending an evil spirit to hell or sending a good spirit who's trying to interfere and help up to heaven. So we've kind of got links almost to Christmas Carol there as well, haven't we? So the National Theatre have been running this production. This is an old programme cover for this particular production by a director called Stephen Daldry. And you'll find clips from that production online. And definitely when we're revising, we'll have a look at some of those clips too. And this idea of The Exorcist, well, hopefully you can see from this programme cover and this DVD cover from the movie The Exorcist, nothing to do with spectacles, how the National Theatre have borrowed, I should say, lots of the iconography from The Exorcist to present their own Inspector Ghoul. Okay, so you can see the kind of almost film noir smoke coming across there. You've got the lamppost in Inspector Calls, and that's similar to the video version we've been watching too. Here you've got the lamp as well. Here you've got this idea that there's a spotlight coming in from the back, and in this film you've got the light pouring out of a window, possibly where the evil possessed child is, who needs to have the evil spirits exorcised from her. So this idea, is the inspector an exorcist? I kind of agree with it, in as much as it links into the other ideas. So do you remember that quotation? The inspector has a disconcerting habit of looking very hard at the person he's about to speak to before he speaks to them. So it is like he's looking for their conscience. So rather than try and draw out an evil spirit, he's trying to draw out the confession in that person to try and reveal the good that's within. So it's almost like he's working as a reverse exorcist in a way, not trying to draw out the evil, but trying to draw out the good and the morality in that person. And definitely when we've got staging and costume like this, people who know about film will immediately spot that intertextuality and the similarity. Even if they do it subconsciously, they'll have that idea that this inspector, our inspector, is like an exorcist. Now, the other thing that this National Theatre presentation does is it links in really well to this idea of a time traveller. Because remember that the play is set in 1912. And this character here is not dressed in 1912 costume. This character here is dressed in a very stereotypical late 1940s, early 1950s costume, in that, as I said, that film noir kind of hard-boiled detective trench coat, which was a genre from the 1950s. So he's definitely presented as, well, actually the other one as well. A real policeman caught out of time. So it's almost as if you've got this inspector from the late 1940s, the early 1950s, who's been sent back in time, knowing what he knows, back to 1912 to challenge the Burling family. So it's a really clever interpretation from the National Theatre, because it's working on many different levels. So it's not the obvious one that I would jump to, but I think when we look at that presentation, I think they make a convincing a really convincing case for clothing him, costuming him in these out of time outfits, and this idea that he's drawing out something from the Burlings, hopefully some good in the Burlings. Okay, so that's The Exorcist, and I would say only if we're looking at National Theatre presentation, it's 8 out of 10 from me. If we just took it out of context without all this costume and everything, then it's going to be lower, probably a 4 or 5 out of 10, but it makes sense in the way they've used their dramatic devices. Okay, so the next one's a ghost or a ghoul. So a ghost or a ghoul, let's focus on the ghoul part of that. It is something that is undead. So ghoul is something undead. And if you look that up on the internet, so ghoul will feast on dead human bodies, are often found in graveyards. Now, earlier in an earlier video, I defined a ghoul as well as this kind of undead creature that feeds on souls. So, do you think that Inspector Ghoul is a ghoul? Well, kind of the clue is in the name, isn't it? Okay, because it's a homophone for this spelling of ghoul just here. So I definitely think that he seems to kind of almost loiter around the dead and the dying, like Eva Smith. And he's not trying to prevent that death. He's just experimenting with that death, kind of playing with that death. He definitely looks into those eyes again that we've already mentioned and tries to draw out the soul or the conscience of the Burlings. So if we take that meaning, yeah, he definitely is a ghoul. However, he doesn't present like a horrible killing monster. He doesn't seem to be like a zombie. But this idea of the undead, a bit like a zombie, could tap into the idea of the way that the working classes are being treated. Not like humanity, they're not being treated fairly. So depending on what definition of ghoul you use depends on how much you agree with that. I'd say his ghoul is about 50-50 there. Okay, so maybe you can put a case forward for that, but you have to kind of tweak the meaning of the word a little bit. So that's ghoul. Okay, so this is my strongest, and I think 10 out of 10. This is what J.B. Priestley is trying to achieve. And that's very weird if we think about the work that we've done on Inspector Ghoul's being a well-made play, but we're saying the inspector actually isn't a real person at all. He's just kind of within them all. And that's kind of what I'm saying. If you can imagine that this little guy from Pinocchio, he's that voice inside your head that's telling you what's right and what's wrong. It's your conscience. And we've got certain members of the Burling family who don't want to listen to that voice. Mr. and Mrs. Burling certainly do not want to listen to that voice, their conscience, because they don't like what they hear. Arguably, Eric has already listened to his conscience before the play has even begun. And certainly in the student production that we've been watching, Eric is struggling with his conscience, definitely in that angsty scene where he's beating against the walls. And if you go on to watch the BBC production of An Inspector Calls that was released a couple of years ago, also you see Eric as a young man who's struggling with his conscience throughout the play, although in both versions you don't understand why until later. So Eric probably had a conscience. Sheila certainly didn't. She was just like a little Mrs. Burling. But as soon as she finds that conscience, she's absolutely changed woman. Mr. and Mrs. Burling find their conscience for a while, but then they forget about their morality and their conscience as soon as it becomes unimportant. As soon as they believe that the inspector was a fraud, they forget everything that they've learned and they lose that again. So the reason that I really, really believe in this, we've been looking at all the way through the play and all the other videos, and that is that Inspector Ghoul doesn't have his own voice. Yeah, he gets quite angry sometimes. That wrath that we talked about, that powerful anger, like that godlike anger. But most of the time when he's talking to Gerald, the Burlings, and Sheila, he sounds just like them. So when he's talking to Mrs. Burling, he says, "I don't think you're telling me the truth," which you can just imagine her saying that to Eva Smith when Eva Smith went in for that meeting. When he talks to Mr. Burling, he talks in terms of money because he knows that that's what Mr. Burling understands. That's how Mr. Burling makes sense of his world. He's also very rude and blunt to both Mr. and Mrs. Burling, because when they talk, even to their own family, let alone people like Eva Smith, they're rude and blunt too. However, when he talks to Sheila, he talks to Sheila in terms of looks, like, was she pretty? Yes, she was very pretty. He talks to Sheila in terms of clothing, all the things that tie in with Sheila's life. And then when the inspector carries on interviewing them and eventually leaves, Sheila takes on his words. It's as if he's found her conscience, and now that she's found her conscience, she doesn't need she doesn't need the inspector there to help her find it anymore. She just carries on his words. And so that's Sheila. And then of course with Eric, he's not strict to Eric. He gives Eric time to answer. He lets Eric have a drink before he goes ahead and tells his story. And arguably, Eric treated her the worst, even though Eric makes amends for it. And arguably, Eric has acted the worst because he committed an actual crime. The inspector is much more gentle with Eric all the way through it because Eric's already racked with guilt, so he doesn't need that rudeness, that sharpness, and that bluntness that the inspector's given to Mr. and Mrs. B. So this is the one that I really, really think that JB Priestley is trying to get into our minds, that these guys didn't have much of a conscience before the inspector arrived, and he comes in and he replaces that. We can prove that through the language that is used. If you still don't get that, drop me a message underneath. I'll try and explain it and give you some examples. Okay, so the next one is a prankster. So this is Mr. Burling's interpretation. It's just a hoax. It's just a trick. We've been had. And I'm going to write this one off straight away because we know that we can't trust anything that Mr. Burling says. Certainly JB Priestley is not getting one of Mr. Burling's enemies to try and play a prank on the whole family. What a strange and sick prank it would actually be. So I'm absolutely writing that off at 0 out of 10. It's what Mr. Burling believes, but he's not just a prankster, the inspector. Certainly not. Okay, this is a really, really weird one. This was doing the rounds in one of the study guides about 15 years ago, and it kind of ties up with the idea of the ghoul and the undead and the dead and the not so dead, and the kind of whole ghostly vibe, and it kind of goes with the time traveler thing a little bit as well. So if you've read about this one or you saw that and thought, oh, maybe, then I'd say, okay, it's a little bit out there. If you wanted to put it in your essay, it would need some careful explanation, and I think it would just be as and maybe on one of your points about the time traveler thing. Okay, so I mean, actually, if we look technically at this one, the numbers don't add up. So if the play is set in 1912, but was first performed and written in 1945, then maths tells me that if the inspector is either an errors on board child in 1945, he would be 33. I think my maths is right, 33. And it says clearly in the stage direction that he's a man in his 50s. So I think maths is saving the day in English literature today. I'm going to say it's not an 0 out of 10 like the prankster one. It's probably a 2 out of 10. I wouldn't be putting it in my essay personally, because I think it's a little bit out there and the examiner will be like, what? And it could lead you down a really weird path. So definitely in my diamond 9, this one would be down towards the bottom. Okay, here's a really, really popular interpretation. So is Inspector Ghoul like a god? And this is going to link into my last point as well. So those of you who've studied a little bit of religious studies or philosophy and ethics or whatever fancy name they're calling it these days, you may know that God with a capital G in the Christian faith is described as omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. So omnipresent means he is everywhere, he's all around us. Omnipotent means he's all powerful. And omniscient means he's all knowing and all seeing as well. If you're all knowing, you're all seeing. Well, I guess if you're powerful and present, then you can see everything. Anyway, so is the inspector a kind of God or a representation of God? I'd say it's a maybe. He does seem to know an awful lot about both the Burlings and Eva Smith, but then arguably that's his job as an inspector. Is he all powerful? Well, perhaps he is, but he cannot change the fact that Eva Smith dies in the end. However, perhaps as a god, that's his choice, to make sure that she dies and keeps dying so that these people can learn their lesson. So I would say, yeah, he is a god-like figure with his knowledge and this kind of like the power to get inside the Burlings' heads, if you like. So I'd probably give a god 6 out of 10. If I said he is a god-like figure, maybe I'd promote that to about 7 out of 10. So very possibly a god. Okay, and the last one then is Inspector Ghoul the author himself? And I would probably give this one a resounding 10 out of 10, or on a bad day, a 9 out of 10. J.B. Priestley was a socialist. So he believed in social equality. He believed in the redistribution of wealth. So it's much more equality in society. So basically everything the inspector wanted for Eva Smith was similar to what J.B. Priestley wanted. Now, J.B. Priestley, most of his life, he didn't support a particular political party. Although in 1945, he did not join the Labour Party, but he did offer his support towards the Labour Party. And Labour are the political party that most align themselves with the socialist political ideology. And during World War II, J.B. Priestley had a radio programme on the BBC called Postscripts. And it followed the news during the war. And you can see a picture of him here with his big BBC mic. And in his postscripts, he would offer comfort to the people in the UK who'd been going through the war and probably had loved ones fighting the war. And this had been going on for 6 years, which puts our coronavirus in a little bit of perspective, I think. So he would do this radio show where he would tell lovely anecdotes and he'd talk to the nation. And he really became a kind of a national treasure. However, towards the end of the war, his kind of political message became a lot more strong and a lot more powerful. And because the BBC are meant to be politically impartial, they're not meant to take sides. And because there was an election coming up, really sadly, his radio show was taken off the air because it was contravening the BBC's code of conduct because of its political content. So without his radio show, and JB Priestley had to think of a different way to get his message across to the people of the UK. And at the time, his message was, if you want something like socialism, if you want social equality, if you want a new NHS, and you want a welfare state that's going to protect people who've fallen on hard time, like Eva Smith, then the Labour Party are the people to vote for. And the other point that he was making, which we've seen at the end of the play, is you're not going to get much help from the older generations, people in their 50s and above. You've just seen in my play, they don't want to change. They like things the way they are. Winston Churchill, great prime minister, but he doesn't want things to change. He doesn't want social equality. He wants the old class system back. He wants it back to the way that it was in Edwardian times. JB Priestley saying, I don't want that. And he's kind of saying, come on, young people like Eric and people like Sheila, it's down to you. You're the guys who are going to have to make the difference here. And I've just shown you in my play that you do have the capacity to change. I've shown you your voices have got louder through the play until you're yelling at the older generation, because you can stand up for yourselves now and you can have your own voice. And the first thing you can do to show your own voice is to go and vote in this election. And indeed, in that election, the Labour Party won what's called a landslide. So they didn't just win by a little bit, like in the Brexit vote, for example, they won massively. So even though Winston Churchill had got us through this brutal world war and we come through victorious, people were like, yeah, he got us through the war, but he's a wartime leader. And now we want a peacetime leader, someone who is kind, a political party that's going to give us a welfare state, a political party that cares about everybody in society, not just about looking after the rich. So I think that JB Priestley used an in spectacles to kind of replace the message he was trying to get across in his radio show. And that's the message that society all mixing up together and having much more social justice and much more fairness is the way forward. And because of rationing and things like that, that did happen after the war. And these people who were born in that post-war era, the people that we call boomers, they did boom because after this kind of social revolution, they had the best childhoods and the best teenage years in the 1960s, and they bought houses when houses were still cheap, and they're still having the time of their lives now while the rest of us are all struggling. So that's where the boomers came from, actually, this post-World War II boom, where these socialist and the socialist values and the welfare state and everything just really, really took off. My goodness, what a shame that we couldn't have stuck with that even after rationing and everything was over. So those are my 9 different ideas about who the inspector is. 2 of those I've rejected, but the other 7 I think that you can definitely get some meaning out of for your essays. So that's it for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.